As the title would suggest, this is a book on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during and after the First World War, the various operations that took place, and just why things happened the way that it did. Disclaimer: yes, in my day job, I own a publishing company. We publish military history, although I don't think we publish anything that directly relates to this book or would be a competitor to it. That being said, I feel that it's something I should mention. Back to the book. I picked this up through Amazon's cheap Kindle Books deals. You can find some great stuff for just a couple of bucks, which is always nice. Other books that I've read on this, which might shed some light on the topic, would be Alan Moorehead's book on Gallipoli, which is, or at least was, the standard book, typically from the Australian and New Zealander perspective. If there's something more recent, if you happen to know of something like that, by all means, mention it in the comments. I would love to take a look at it. I've also read the Osprey title on Gallipoli, which was one of the early Osprey campaign books, which did a pretty good job of, again, primarily giving the British, Australian, New Zealander perspective, with not much on the Turkish side. One of the reasons why I picked up this book was to hopefully be able to read more about that. It didn't quite work out, as will soon become apparent. First, we'll deal with what this does well. If you're looking for a book that involves itself in the geopolitics of the situation and explains why the Ottoman Empire did what they did, the alliance with Germany, for instance, then this is the book for you. It does an excellent job at explaining the reasoning behind the various decisions, why they entered the war when they did, how the decision by the British to seize their ships caused such rage and anger, logically enough. Since this is focused solely on the Ottoman Empire, it allows for focus on topics that would only be touched upon in a larger work, in a couple paragraphs or pages. We get an entire chapter, for instance, devoted to the Armenian genocide and just how complicit the Turkish state was. There's also a fascinating look at just how the Turkish officials attempted to use Muslim religious figures to cause problems for the French and English amongst their various imperial possessions, which is something that actually was very effective at causing problems and actually changed British policy several times, which worked better for them than they could have possibly hoped. Although, ironically, when we think about this sort of thing today, it's typically the Arab revolt that comes to mind, thanks to Lawrence, as well as the later film. This leads me to the frustration I have with this book. As much as it talks about how it's going to bring in to English military history writing the Turkish experience, when we get down to the level of the individual, there are some eyewitness accounts, but not as much as I would have hoped for, particularly when we're talking about various military operations. Gallipoli in particular is mostly written from the perspective of the British and from the Anzacs. There is some Turkish material here, there's some poetry, there's a few letters, but the narrative is very much on the other side of the hill. The same is true of the Arab revolt. We get plenty here about Lawrence talking to various Arab chieftains and the like, and all the politicking happening behind the scenes in Cairo. But how exactly did Turkey attempt to counteract this? There isn't really much here on that, and that's frustrating. Now, the author does point out that some of the problems with developing Turkish sources involve that simply they're not there or not accessible. For instance, that the Turkish military archive is difficult, if not impossible, to get into for Western historians, and that the archives set up by the various successor states tend to be more focused on their own attempts to gain their freedom and their own history as opposed to the wider history of the Ottomans. So acknowledging that fact, it is understandable that there might not be much available, but again, I would have hoped for a little more. There is some good stuff here. You're going to learn something, but if you think that there's going to be a huge amount of eyewitness material, it's just not here. I liked this, and I typically judge books on how quickly am I going to reread something. There's some books that I read every year, some that I read every couple years, while others it's farther out. I think this is going to be something I'm going to want to revisit, perhaps in 2 or 3 years, or if I'm reading a bunch of books around this topic to refresh myself. I'm also going to be looking for more by this author. I found his writing to be clear, nice and concise, and excellent at explaining often complex concepts and making, at least to me, the complex history of the Ottoman Empire, particularly before the First World War, clear, which was an excellent part of the book. So I recommend this. I hope you'd enjoyed this review, and if you have, please do all the things that you're supposed to do on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, and the like, and I will be back shortly with another review. Thank you very much. Have a good day.